The final click of the lock echoed in the empty hallway, a sound as sharp and definitive as a guillotine's blade. Elena stood on the other side of the door, the flimsy eviction notice crushed in her trembling hand. The paper felt brittle, a dead thing. A wave of nausea rose in her throat as she stared at the peeling paint of the door that had been her home just moments before. She could feel the cold concrete of the landing seeping through the thin soles of her worn-out shoes, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the abyss that had just opened up beneath her. Behind her, she heard a small sniffle. Lucas, her 8-year-old, was trying to be brave, his small shoulders squared, but 5-year-old Sophia had buried her face in Elena's coat, her tiny body shaking with silent sobs. The city's indifferent hum, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of traffic, felt a million miles away. They were an island of 3, adrift in a sea of concrete, and the tide was going out. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone, screaming a single, terrifying question. What now? She led them to a grimy bus stop bench, the plastic cold and unyielding. Under the flickering orange glow of a street lamp, Elena emptied her purse. The contents were pathetic. A few crumpled tissues, a half-used tube of lip balm, and the money. She flattened the bills with numb fingers, $1.50, $1.20, a 5, 3 singles, then the coins, a cascade of silver and copper that felt impossibly light in her palm. She counted them twice, her lips moving silently. $78. That was it. $78 stood between her children and starvation. A dry, hacking cough escaped Sophia's lips, a sound that sliced through Elena's soul. The little girl shivered, her breath misting in the frigid air. Elena felt a familiar hollow ache in her own stomach, the gnawing pain of a hunger she had been ignoring for 2 days, but the pain in her heart was infinitely worse. It was the crushing weight of absolute failure, a cold, heavy stone lodged in her chest, making it difficult to breathe. This wasn't just poverty. This was the precipice of oblivion. There was one last, desperate idea, a ghost of a rumor she'd overheard from another cook at the diner before she was fired, an abandoned train car, sitting on a forgotten siding miles outside of town, a metal box. Not a home, but a shield, a sliver of hope so thin it was almost transparent. "It's an adventure," she whispered to Lucas, forcing a smile that felt like cracking glass. "A secret fort, just for us." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. The journey was a blur of misery. They walked for what felt like hours after the last bus dropped them at the edge of town, a single, lumpy bag digging into Elena's shoulder. The wind howled, a hungry predator whipping at their faces and tearing through their thin jackets. Lucas stumbled, his face pale with exhaustion, while she carried a sleeping Sophia, whose small, feverish body felt impossibly heavy. Every step was a battle against the rising tide of despair. She could feel the last embers of her strength fading, leaving only the raw animal instinct to protect her young, a feeling that was both a fire in her belly and a scream in her mind. And then she saw it. Silhouetted against the bruised purple of the twilight sky, the train car was not a fort. It was a carcass, a long, rust-eaten metal coffin abandoned to the elements. The hope that had propelled her forward shattered instantly. A profound, suffocating silence pressed in on them, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind as it sliced through countless holes in the metal shell. As she stepped closer, the stench hit her, a thick, gagging miasma of mold, decay, and stagnant water. She reached out a hand to touch the wall, and the metal was shockingly cold, wet and slimy. It felt like touching a tombstone. This wasn't shelter. It was a trap. The isolation was absolute, a crushing physical presence that stole the air from her lungs. Miles from any road, any light, any help, a fresh wave of nausea washed over her, colder and more terrifying than before. The last flicker of hope died in her heart, replaced by a bone-deep, primal fear. She had not led her children to safety. She had led them to their grave. That first night was a descent into a frozen hell. They huddled together on the warped floor, a miserable pile of shivering bodies in the crushing blackness. The cold was a physical entity, a predator with icy teeth that gnawed at their bones. Elena wrapped her own threadbare coat around the children, her body absorbing the relentless chill until her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Sophia's cough echoed in the metal box, each small sound a hammer blow to Elena's spirit. She lay awake, every nerve screaming, listening to the rhythmic drip, drip, drip from a leak in the roof, a maddening water torture. The sound of unseen things scuttling in the walls made her skin crawl. Her stomach cramped with a hunger so sharp it felt like a blade twisting in her gut. Silent tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks as she stared into the darkness, a prisoner in a rusty cage of her own desperation. The story of her fight for survival has just begun. To follow Elena's incredible journey and find out if a mother's love can conquer impossible odds, make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next. The cold of the plastic bench seeped into Elena's bones, a relentless, creeping chill that mirrored the ice forming around her heart. She looked down at Sophia, whose small face was pale and slick with a feverish sweat, even in the biting air. The child's cough, a dry, rasping sound, echoed in the hollow space of the bus shelter, each one a tiny accusation. Lucas sat beside her, silent, his eyes wide and fixed on the darkness beyond the street lamp's sickly orange glow. He was trying so hard to be the man of the family, a role no 8-year-old should ever have to play. Elena felt the $78 in her pocket, a pathetic lump of paper and metal. It was nothing. It was an insult. Then, the memory surfaced, a phantom of a conversation. An old train car in on the Barros land, just sitting there. At the time, it was just kitchen gossip. Now, it was a lifeline, a terrible, rusty, desperate lifeline. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the hunger and exhaustion conspiring to drag her down, but she fought it. She had to. The image of the car solidified in her mind, not as a ruin, but as a shield, a metal shell against the world. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the frigid air burning her lungs, and forced her face into a mask of maternal confidence she was nowhere near feeling. She turned to Lucas, her voice a strained whisper she tried to fill with excitement. "Hey," she said, nudging him gently. "I have an idea, a secret plan." His gaze shifted to her, his eyes clouded with a weariness that broke her heart. "What if we go on an adventure? A real one? I heard about a secret fort, a magic metal castle, just waiting for us. Nobody knows about it." The lie felt like swallowing shards of glass, each word a painful cut. Sophia stirred in her sleep, whimpering. Elena smoothed her hair, her own hand trembling. "We can be pioneers," she continued, her voice gaining a false, frantic energy. "We'll be warm and safe, and it will be our special place." Lucas stared at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, a tiny flicker of something, not quite belief, but a willingness to believe, appeared in his eyes. He gave a small, hesitant nod. The weight of that simple gesture was immense. She had bought them a few more hours of hope with a currency of lies. The last bus of the night arrived with a hydraulic hiss, its brakes squealing in protest. It felt like a ghost ship, its interior dimly lit and mostly empty. As Elena herded her children up the high steps, she felt the tired, judging eyes of the few other passengers. A woman with a pinched face pulled her purse closer. An old man in a grease-stained jacket stared blankly out the window, lost in his own world. Elena paid the fare, the coins clinking with a sound of finality, and guided the children to a seat in the back. The vinyl was cracked and cold, smelling faintly of disinfectant and despair. She pulled Lucas and Sophia close, creating a small pocket of shared warmth. The engine rumbled beneath their feet, a low, constant vibration that seemed to run right through her exhausted body. The doors wheezed shut, sealing them inside. As the bus pulled away from the curb, leaving the familiar city lights behind, Eleanor felt a profound sense of dislocation. They were truly untethered now, heading into an unknown darkness, propelled by a story she had invented out of thin air. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The city's glow receded in the grimy rear window until it was just a faint smudge on the horizon, and then it was gone completely. Outside, there was only blackness, a deep, rural dark punctuated by the brief, ghostly flash of a passing tree or a fence post in the headlights. Sophia had fallen back into a restless sleep on Elena's lap, her breathing shallow and raspy. Lucas sat rigidly, his face pressed against the cold glass, pretending to watch the darkness fly by. Eleanor knew he was just trying to be strong for her. She could feel the tension in his small body, the fear he was trying so hard to contain. She rested her chin on the top of his head, smelling the faint, sweet scent of his hair, and a fresh wave of protective love washed over her, so fierce it was painful. This love was the only real thing she had left. The bus swayed and rattled, its tires humming on the asphalt, a lonely sound in the vast, empty night. Each mile marker they passed felt like another step away from civilization, another step deeper into a wilderness from which they might never return. The hope she had manufactured felt thinner now, more fragile. The bus finally shuddered to a stop at a desolate crossroads marked only by a leaning wooden sign. The driver grunted, "Last stop," without turning around. The hydraulic hiss of the door opening was the sound of an airlock being breached, expelling them into a hostile environment. The moment they stepped off the bus, the wind hit them like a physical blow. It was a raw, vicious wind that carried the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, and it tore through their inadequate clothing with practiced ease. The bus pulled away with a roar, its red taillights shrinking into the darkness, leaving them in an oppressive silence and a blackness so complete it felt like a physical weight. Elena's eyes struggled to adjust. There was no moon, no stars, just an impenetrable velvet curtain. Her heart seized with a new kind of fear, the fear of total isolation. She hoisted the sleeping Sophia onto her hip, the child's weight a familiar, aching burden. "Hold my hand, Lucas," she said, her voice small against the immense, roaring quiet of the countryside. His small, cold fingers immediately found hers, gripping tight. They began to walk. The directions from the cook had been vague. Follow the old service road by the collapsed fence. But in the dark, every direction looked the same. Elena chose a path that seemed slightly less overgrown, a dirt track barely visible as a faint grey line against the black earth. The ground was uneven and muddy from recent rains, and it sucked at her worn-out shoes with every step. Her arms began to scream from the weight of Sophia and the lumpy bag slung over her other shoulder. A sharp pain shot up her spine. She could hear Lucas stumbling beside her, his breathing becoming ragged. The cold was relentless. It wasn't just a sensation, it was an active force, seeking out every gap in their clothing, every exposed inch of skin. Elena felt a chilling numbness begin in her fingers and toes, a dangerous lethargy creeping into her limbs. Her own breath came in ragged, steaming gasps. The only sounds were the squelch of their feet in the mud, and the ceaseless, mournful howl of the wind through the skeletal branches of unseen trees. It sounded like the world was weeping for them. The adventure was gone. There was no magic castle, no secret fort. There was only the mud, the cold, and the crushing, soul-deep exhaustion. Elena's mind began to play tricks on her. Every rustle in the undergrowth was a predator. Every snap of a twig was a footstep behind them. The darkness seemed to press in, alive and menacing. She could feel Lucas's small hand trembling in hers, and a fresh surge of guilt and shame washed over her. What had she done? She had dragged them from the relative safety of the city streets into this primordial wilderness. The lie she had told him felt like a poison she had forced him to drink. Her thoughts spiraled downwards. She pictured them collapsing here, in the mud, succumbing to the cold. The image was so vivid, so horribly plausible, that she had to physically shake her head to dispel it. A single, hot tear escaped and froze on her cheek. She was no longer just hungry or tired. She felt her very essence, her will to live, being scraped away with every agonizing step. This wasn't a journey toward hope. It was a death march. After what felt like an eternity, a new smell joined the damp earth and decaying leaves on the wind. It was a sharp, metallic tang, rust. The scent grew stronger, an acrid perfume that made her stomach clench. Her eyes, now better adjusted to the gloom, could just make out a long, low shape ahead, a darker slash against the dark grey sky. It was unnaturally straight, unnaturally still. Her heart gave a painful lurch. The train car. For a fleeting second, a spark of the original, desperate hope reignited. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe it would have 4 solid walls and a roof. Maybe it would be enough. She quickened her pace, pulling a stumbling Lucas along with her. "We're almost there, mijo," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Almost to our fort." The words felt hollow, a ghost of the lie she had told earlier. As they drew closer, the shape resolved itself, and the small spark of hope inside her began to flicker and die. This was not a fort. This was not a castle. The silhouette was jagged, broken. It looked like the skeletal remains of some great metal beast that had crawled here to die long ago. The reality was so much worse than her most pessimistic fears. The train car was a carcass, picked clean by years of neglect and harsh weather. It sat tilted at a precarious angle, as if the earth was slowly trying to swallow it. Huge, gaping holes of rust pockmarked its sides, looking like raw weeping wounds. One end of the roof had partially collapsed inward, creating a jagged maw open to the sky. The wind whistled through the countless openings, producing a low, moaning sound, a chorus of dereliction. Elena stopped, her feet feeling as if they were rooted to the muddy ground. A profound, suffocating silence pressed in on them, broken only by that mournful, airy song. The metallic stench was overpowering now, mixed with the damp, gagging odor of mildew and something else, the unmistakable smell of animal droppings. She felt the last vestiges of her strength drain out of her, leaving a void filled with cold, black despair. This wasn't shelter. This wasn't a last resort. This was a death trap. She had led her children to a tomb. Sophia chose that moment to wake up. Her eyes fluttered open, and she took in the horrifying sight of the rusted hulk before them. Her lower lip began to tremble. "Mama," she whimpered, her voice raspy. "I'm scared." Lucas, who had been silent for so long, finally let out a small, choked sob. He let go of Elena's hand and buried his face in her coat, his small body shaking uncontrollably. The sound of her children's fear was the final blow. Elena felt something inside her shatter, the mask of the brave mother, the strong provider, the teller of hopeful tales. It all crumbled into dust. She stood there, a statue of failure, with the weight of her sleeping daughter in one arm and her weeping son clinging to her leg, staring at the monument to her own catastrophic misjudgment. The cold was no longer just outside her, it was inside, freezing her from the soul outwards. There was no adventure. There was no hope. There was only this rust-eaten coffin and the terrifying realization that she had failed them in the most fundamental way a mother could. She had brought them to a place worse than the streets they had fled. With leaden limbs, she forced herself to move forward. The door of the train car hung crookedly on a single, groaning hinge. She set Sophia down, her own legs trembling with exhaustion, and grabbed the edge of the door. The metal was icy and slick with a film of algae. It took all of her remaining strength to pull it open. The sound it made was a hellish, drawn-out screech of metal on metal, a sound of protest and decay that echoed in the dead air. The noise sent a fresh shiver of fear through the children, who clung to her even tighter. A wave of putrid air washed over them, a thick, suffocating stench of stagnant water, advanced mold, and the sharp ammonia smell of rat urine. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed and rotting for decades. Eleanor gagged, her stomach heaving. She could hear the frantic scuttling of unseen things in the darkness inside, disturbed by the noise and the sudden intrusion of fresh air. She peered into the black maw of the car's interior. It was a darkness that felt different from the night outside. It felt heavier, ancient, and deeply unwell. Taking a hesitant step inside, her foot landed on the floor with a wet, spongy crunch. The wooden planks were soft and rotten, saturated with years of leaking water. They groaned ominously under her slight weight, and she had the terrifying sensation that she might fall right through into whatever foul space lay beneath. The air inside was thick and damp, clinging to her skin and clothes instantly. It was colder than it was outside, a deep, penetrating cold that came from the damp metal walls and the stagnant air. Her eyes could make out nothing but shapes in the gloom, piles of debris, a gaping hole in the roof through which she could see the starless sky and the glint of moisture on every surface. A steady drip, drip, drip from the collapsed section of the roof echoed in the claustrophobic space, a maddeningly persistent sound that was already starting to drill into her skull. She felt a profound sense of being trapped, not just in a train car, but in the absolute nadir of her life. This was the bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. Lucas's voice, barely a whisper, cut through the darkness. "Mama, can we go home?" The simple, impossible question broke the dam of Elena's control. A dry, ragged sob escaped her throat, an ugly sound of pure anguish. She sank to her knees on the rotten, filthy floor, heedless of the dampness and the filth. She pulled her 2 children into her arms, burying her face in their hair, and wept. The tears were hot on her frozen cheeks, but they offered no warmth, no release. They were tears of utter and complete despair. All the fight, all the manufactured hope, all the desperate energy that had carried her this far evaporated, leaving only a hollowed-out shell. She had no more lies to tell, no more plans to make. She was empty, huddled in the stinking, freezing darkness of a metal coffin, surrounded by the sounds of decay and the smell of ruin. Elena finally admitted defeat. She had not brought her children to a shelter. She had brought them here to die. A chilling calm settled over her, the terrifying peace of someone who has lost everything, including hope itself. Days had blurred into a single, grey, monotonous smear of survival. The train car was a resonant iron cage of cold a chamber for the amplified sounds of their shared misery. Sophia's weak cough was the metronome, the steady, maddening drip from the ceiling was the percussion, and the shrill wail of the wind through the rusted holes was the endless, mournful choir. Eleanor's world had shrunk to this claustrophobic space, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, the constant, shivering tremor in her limbs, and the hollow ache in her heart as she watched her children slowly fade. She spent her waking hours in a Sisyphean battle against the elements, tearing strips from a mouldy, threadbare blanket she'd found to stuff into the larger cracks in the walls. Each strip of damp cloth was a tiny, futile prayer against the encroaching frost. The hunger was a dull, constant fire in her belly, but the fear for her children was a raging inferno that consumed all other thoughts, leaving her a hollowed-out shell animated only by a primal, desperate instinct to endure one more frozen hour, one more night. It was during one of these desperate attempts at insulation that the fabric of their reality began to tear. Eleanor was focused on a particularly vicious draft that seemed to pour from the floor itself, a river of icy air that pooled around their feet as they slept. She was on her hands and knees, her joints aching from the cold, pushing a balled-up rag into a gap between 2 warped floorboards. "Mama!" Lucas's voice was a quiet murmur beside her. He was lying on his stomach, his face close to the filthy floor, not playing, but observing with the intense, focused curiosity of a bored child. "This one is different." Elena, consumed by her task, barely heard him. "Not now, mijo. Help me with these rags." He didn't move. "No, look," he insisted, his small finger tracing the edge of a single plank. "It moves." His words, so quiet, were nearly swallowed by the howling wind, but they planted a tiny, insistent seed in the frozen soil of Elena's exhausted mind. She felt a flicker of annoyance, but then a deeper, stranger feeling began to stir within her. She paused, the rag still in her hand, and leaned closer, following his gaze. He was right. While the other floorboards were warped and uneven, fused together by years of rust and rot, this single plank seemed distinct, its edges more clearly defined, as if it had been cut intentionally. It sat just a fraction of a millimeter lower than its neighbors. It was a detail so small, so insignificant, that only a child's eye, inches from the ground, could have ever noticed it. Eleanor felt a strange sensation, a feeling she hadn't experienced in weeks, a prickle of genuine curiosity. It was a foreign emotion, in a landscape of pure dread. She pressed down on one end of the board with her thumb. It gave way slightly with a soft and spongy squelch, then rose back into place. It was loose. Her heart, which had been beating a slow, tired rhythm, gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. The cold, the hunger, the oppressive despair. For a split second, all of it receded, replaced by an electrifying question. Why? Why was this one board different from all the others? A strange energy, born not of strength, but of sudden, intense intrigue, coursed through her. She forgot the biting cold that was numbing her fingers. She forgot the gnawing pain in her stomach. Kneeling on the damp, filthy floor, she scraped away the grime from the edges of the plank with her fingernails. The dirt was caked on, a hard-packed mixture of mud, rust, and something unpleasantly organic. Underneath, she could clearly see the straight, cut lines of the plank. This was no accident of decay. This was deliberate. A tiny, almost imperceptible notch was carved into one end, just large enough for a fingertip. Her breath hitched. A secret. The word bloomed in her mind, wild and improbable. Here, in this forgotten metal tomb, a place of endings, There was a secret waiting to be found. A wave of adrenaline washed over her, a feeling so potent it made her feel dizzy. For the first time since they had arrived, a sliver of light, not of hope, but of profound mystery, had pierced the suffocating darkness of her world. Her fingers, numb and clumsy with cold, fumbled at the small notch. She tried to get a purchase, to lift the board, but her nails were brittle and they bent and tore against the wood. A sharp pain shot through her finger as a long, dirty splinter slid deep under the nail, but she barely registered it. The mystery was a hook that had sunk deep into her mind, pulling her forward. The board wouldn't budge. It was swollen with dampness, wedged tightly in place. Sophia and Lucas watched her, their faces pale and serious in the gloomy half-light, their own discomfort forgotten as they were caught up in their mother's sudden feverish intensity. Elena felt a surge of frustration. She could feel that there was something beneath the board, a hollow space, a void that shouldn't be there. The possibility, however faint, was a tangible thing now. It was a locked door, and she had to find the key. Her mind raced, sifting through the debris of the past few days, searching for a solution, for anything that could give her leverage. Then she remembered, a glint of metal she had seen half buried in the mud and weeds just outside the train car's screeching door, a long, rust-pitted iron bar, a crowbar. The thought sent a fresh jolt of purpose through her. "Stay here," she ordered the children, her voice tight and commanding. She scrambled to her feet, her body screaming in protest, and pushed against the groaning metal door. Stepping outside, the brutal shock of the wind hit her again, a physical slap to the face that stole her breath. It was colder now, the air filled with the promise of sleet, each gust carrying 1,000 icy needles. She ignored it. Her eyes scanned the muddy ground, frantically searching. There, a long dark shape almost swallowed by the earth. She grabbed it, her bare hands instantly protesting against the shockingly cold, rough texture of the rusted iron. It was heavy, a solid, brutal tool. As she carried it back inside, she felt like a different person. She was no longer just a victim of her circumstances. She was an explorer, a treasure hunter on the verge of a discovery. Back in the dim, freezing interior, the air felt charged with anticipation. The children huddled together, their eyes wide and fixed on the formidable tool in her hands. Elena knelt again, positioning the flattened, wedge-like tip of the crowbar into the thin seam beside the loose plank. The iron was so cold it felt like it was burning her skin, but she held it steady. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the frigid, moldy air filling her lungs, and pushed down. The first attempt resulted in a sickening scraping sound as the metal slid against the rotten wood, failing to find a purchase. A groan of frustration escaped her lips. She repositioned the crowbar, angling it deeper this time, forcing the tip into the wood itself. She put her shoulder into it, leveraging her entire body weight onto the iron bar. There was a low groan, not from her, but from the floor itself, the sound of wood fibers stretching, protesting, beginning to tear. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, tense silence of the car. It was working. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the screaming pain in her shoulder and the agonizing cold of the iron bar. Sweat, cold and slick, beaded on her forehead despite the freezing temperature. She pushed harder, a low, guttural grunt escaping her lips. There was a sharp crack, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the confined space. Sophia flinched and let out a small cry. The board hadn't come up, but it had shifted, lifting just a centimeter. A puff of air, shockingly cold and smelling of deep, damp earth and decay, escaped from the gap. It was the smell of a place that had not breathed for a very, very long time. That scent, the smell of something unearthed, spurred her on. It was confirmation. There was a space below. With a final, desperate heave, she threw all of her remaining strength into the effort. The wood screamed in protest, and then, with a loud, splintering crack, the plank gave way, flipping over and landing with a wet thud on the floor beside the hole it had once covered. Dust and bits of rotten wood filled the air, and Elena coughed, her eyes fixed on the black, rectangular void she had just revealed. The hole was a perfect, dark square, about 2 feet by 2 feet, a neatly concealed compartment. The air that rose from it was ancient and cold, a tangible presence that made the hairs on her arms stand up. A shiver, completely unrelated to the temperature, traced a path down her spine. The despair that had been her constant companion was gone, replaced by a dizzying mixture of fear and exhilaration. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from adrenaline. She leaned over the opening, peering into the inky blackness. At first she could see nothing. It seemed to be an empty, shallow space, lined with more rotting wood. A wave of disappointment washed over her. Had it all been for nothing? Was it just an old empty storage box? But then, as her eyes slowly adjusted to the deeper gloom, she saw it. Something nestled in the far corner. It wasn't a distinct shape, just a darker mass against the darkness. Something that seemed to absorb the faint light rather than reflect it. A new surge of electricity shot through her veins. It wasn't empty. She reached her hand into the opening, her arm disappearing into the chilling darkness. Her fingers brushed against something cold, damp, and horrifyingly soft. She recoiled with a gasp, her heart leaping into her throat. Rotted cloth, or something worse. She pictured a nest of rats, or the desiccated remains of some poor animal. The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand gripping her insides, but the mystery was stronger. She had to know. Taking another shaky breath, she forced her hand back into the void. This time, she moved more slowly, her fingers exploring the space with a terrifying delicacy. She bypassed the soft, spongy mass and probed deeper, her fingertips brushing against a surface that was solid, but rough and crumbling. It was wood, its surface disintegrated by dampness. She traced its outline. It was a box, a small rectangular box, wedged tightly in the corner of the hidden compartment. A jolt of pure triumph, sharp and sweet, shot through her, momentarily erasing the fear and the cold. She had found it. With her fingers hooked around one edge, she carefully worked the object loose. It was heavier than she expected, and slick with a film of decay. She pulled it from the darkness and into the dim light of the train car. It was a small wooden chest, perhaps the size of a shoebox. The wood was dark, almost black with age and dampness, and so rotted in places that it looked like a sponge. A thick band of iron, now a solid, lumpy mass of orange and brown rust wrapped around its middle, culminating in a lock that was completely fused shut. It was a pathetic, decaying relic, something that looked like it would crumble to dust if she held it too tightly. Yet, as she held it in her hands, she felt a strange sense of reverence. This object had been deliberately hidden. It had been waiting here in the dark for decades. Waiting for what? Waiting for whom? The questions pounded in her mind, each one more urgent than the last. She felt a connection to an unknown past, a story she had stumbled into the middle of, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that her life was about to change. Lucas and Sophia crept closer, their earlier fear replaced by a wide-eyed wonder. "What is it, Mama?" Lucas whispered, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the crumbling wood. "Is it treasure?" The word hung in the air, full of childish fantasy and impossible hope. Eleanor looked from the box to her son's face, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't have the heart to extinguish his hope with harsh reality. "I don't know, mijo," she said, her voice soft. "Maybe." She gently shook the box. A faint, muffled rattling sound came from within. It wasn't the heavy clink of coins, but a soft, dry whisper. Paper. Something inside was dry. Something inside had been protected from the decay that had consumed the box itself. That single soft sound was more exciting to her than the imagined sound of gold. Gold could be spent, but paper could hold a story. It could hold a truth. It could hold an answer to the 1,000 questions that were now screaming in her mind. Her gaze fell back to the crowbar lying on the floor. She knew what she had to do next. She felt a tremor of hesitation. What if opening it was a mistake? What if some secrets were better left buried? The thought was a fleeting ghost, quickly banished by the raw, desperate reality of her situation. What did she have to lose? They were freezing, starving, and squatting in a metal coffin. There was no going back to the life she had before, and the future was a terrifying blank. This box, this mystery, was the only thing in her world that wasn't about slow, agonizing decay. It was a beginning of some kind, a new path, even if she had no idea where it led. She set the box down on a relatively stable patch of floor, and picked up the heavy crowbar again. Her hands were steadier now, her movements filled with a new and unfamiliar sense of purpose. She looked at her children, who were watching her with breathless anticipation. She was no longer just their protector. She was their champion, about to break open a door to an unknown world. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. Placing the pointed end of the crowbar against the heavily rusted mass of the lock, she took a deep breath. She had no hammer, so she found a loose, heavy rock near the gaping hole in the wall, its surface gritty and cold. She held it in her right hand, judging its weight. Her first strike was tentative. The rock hit the end of the crowbar with a loud metallic clang that echoed unnervingly in the enclosed space. The impact sent a jarring vibration up her arm, but the lock remained intact, a solid lump of fused iron. A spark flew, briefly illuminating their three pale faces in the gloom. The smell of rust and struck metal filled the air. This was going to be harder than she thought. The lock was not just a mechanism, it was a seal, hardened by 50 years of silent subterranean chemistry. It was a guardian, and it was not going to give up its secret easily. She repositioned the crowbar, took aim, and swung the rock again, this time with more force, her frustration lending strength to her arm. The second blow was more solid. A deeper, more resonant clang reverberated through the car, followed by the faint sound of something cracking. A web of fissures appeared on the surface of the rust. She felt a surge of savage satisfaction. It was yielding. She raised the rock again, her knuckles white. Her focus narrowed to this single violent act. She struck the crowbar again, and again, and again, a frantic, rhythmic pounding that was a release for all her pent-up fear and desperation. Clang, crack, clang. With each blow, more rust flaked away, and the wood of the box lid around the lock began to splinter and protest. The noise was deafening, a brutal symphony of destruction. Her arm began to ache, a deep, burning pain from the repeated impacts. But she didn't stop. She was a woman possessed, driven by an almost primal need to see what was inside, to uncover the truth that had been hidden for so long, right beneath her feet. The world outside, the wind, the cold, her own hunger, it all ceased to exist. With one final desperate cry of exertion, she brought the rock down with all her might. There was a deafening crack, not of metal, but of wood, followed by a sharp, final snap of the iron band. The lock didn't break. The wood around it shattered. The lid of the box, now freed from its iron bond, split in two and fell open with a soft, defeated sigh. A cloud of fine, brown dust, the powdered remains of the rotted interior, puffed into the air, carrying a dry, musty scent like that of a long, unopened book. Eleanor dropped the rock and the crowbar, her arm trembling and useless at her side. She stared, panting, into the newly opened chest. Her heart pounded in her ears. The moment of revelation was here. For a second, her vision was blurred by the dust and her own exhaustion, and she saw nothing but more decay. Then, as the dust settled, she saw it, nestled in a bed of what looked like rotted sawdust, a dark, strangely pristine package. It was an object that radiated a sense of profound otherness, of impossible preservation. It was a package, roughly the size of a large book, wrapped in thick, dark oilcloth that glistened faintly in the dim light. The fabric was a deep, greasy black, its folds still sharp, looking as if it had been wrapped yesterday, not decades ago. The contrast was breathtakingly stark. The box around it had succumbed completely to the ravages of time and moisture, crumbling into nothingness, yet this object it had guarded was utterly untouched. It was a time capsule, a message in a bottle sent adrift on an ocean of years. Elena felt an overwhelming sense of awe. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that whatever was inside this package would survive. They had known the train car would leak, that the box would rot, that the world would forget. This careful, deliberate act of preservation spoke of immense foresight and a desperate need for something to endure. It transformed the discovery from a random find into a deliberate inheritance. Her hands trembled as she reached into the wreckage of the box. She lifted the package out. It was heavier than she had anticipated, and the oilcloth felt cool and slightly greasy to the touch, its texture smooth and resilient. It smelled powerfully of old machinery, of grease and oil and metal, a clean industrial scent that was a stark contrast to the surrounding miasma of mold and decay. She held it in her lap, a dark, rectangular mystery. The children leaned in, their small breaths misting in the cold air. "Open it, Mama," Sophia whispered, her voice full of a child's pure, uncomplicated excitement. Eleanor looked at the package, her heart a wild bird in her chest. This was it, the point of no return. Whatever was inside this wrapper would irrevocably change their lives. Whether for better or for worse, she didn't know, but she knew with a chilling certainty that there was no going back to the simple, brutal calculus of survival she had known just an hour before. Taking a deep, fortifying breath that did little to calm her racing pulse, she began to unwrap the package. The oilcloth was stiff, and it crackled in protest as she carefully unfolded the greasy layers. The sound was loud in the tense silence. It was wrapped meticulously, layer after layer, a careful process designed to seal out every last drop of moisture. As she peeled back the final layer of cloth, her fingers brushed against something else, paper. But not just any paper. It was thick and heavy, with a smooth, almost velvety texture. It felt expensive, important. A wave of dizziness washed over her as the full weight of the moment descended. This was real. She wasn't dreaming. This was happening. She slowly drew the contents from their protective sheath. It was a sheaf of papers, folded neatly in three. The top page was a document, its paper a rich, creamy white that seemed to glow in the gloom. It was covered in elegant, looping calligraphy and marked with faded but still legible official stamps, their purplish ink a splash of color in this monochrome world of rust and rot. It was beautiful, ancient, and undeniably official. Her eyes, accustomed to the dim light, scanned the document, struggling with the formal, archaic language. Words like deed, parcel, title, and legal owner jumped out at her, each one sending a small shock through her system. It was a property deed, a legal document for a massive 200-acre parcel of land. The description of the land's boundaries, detailed with references to old creeks and rock formations, seemed to describe the very ground beneath her feet. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind was reeling, unable to process the information. A deed. Here. Why? It made no sense. It was an artifact from another world, another life. She felt a sense of vertigo, as if the rotten floor of the train car had suddenly dropped away, leaving her suspended over a vast, unknown chasm of history. Her eyes continued to scan the page, her heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. Then she saw it, the name of the registered owner, written in a clear, bold hand. It was three words that shattered her understanding of who she was. The name on the deed, the legal and rightful owner of this vast expanse of land, was not a stranger. It was not some long-dead historical figure. The name was Elena Maria da Silva, her own name, her full, legal birth name, a name she hadn't used in years, a name that connected her to a past she barely knew, to a father she had never met. The sight of it, so formally and undeniably written on this ancient document, did not compute. Her mind refused to accept it. It was impossible, a mistake, a hallucination brought on by hunger and cold and despair. She stared at the paper, her eyes tracing the letters of her own name over and over again, as if repetition could make it make sense. A roaring sound filled her ears, and the dim interior of the train car seemed to tilt and spin. She was a fired waitress, a homeless single mother with $78 to her name. She was not the owner of a multi-million-dollar estate. The two realities could not coexist. As she grappled with this impossible revelation, her numb fingers felt something else tucked inside the folded deed. Another piece of paper, smaller and of a different texture. It was a single sheet, folded in half, its edges yellowed with age. It slipped from the folds of the deed and fluttered onto her lap. The paper was softer, more personal, and covered in a spidery, faded blue handwriting. It was not a document. It was a letter. The script was difficult to read, the words of a man who worked with his hands, not a pen. But the address at the top was starkly clear, written in a slightly larger, more deliberate hand. It was not addressed to a specific name. It was addressed to a future that the writer could only pray would come to pass. Her eyes focused on the two words that would rewrite her entire history, that would give a voice to the ghost who had just handed her a kingdom. The letter began with a simple, heart-stopping salutation that reached across 50 years of silence. My future granddaughter. My future granddaughter. The words swam before Eleanor's eyes, shimmering through a fresh veil of tears. She ran her thumb over the faded blue ink, feeling the indentations the pen had made half a century ago. It was a tangible connection, a ghost's handshake across time. The paper itself felt different from the official deed. It was softer, more fragile, yet it had survived. It smelled faintly of oil, but also of something else, a dry, dusty scent like old memories. Her grandfather, a man who was just a name, a phantom in the stories her mother had vaguely told. Now, holding his words, he felt real. His spirit seemed to fill the freezing, metallic space of the train car, a warm presence against the relentless cold. Her hands shook uncontrollably, not from the chill, but from the seismic shock of this revelation. The world she knew, a world of eviction notices and desperate hunger, had cracked open, revealing a history, a legacy, a fight that had been waiting for her birth. The spidery script told a simple story. He was Antonio da Silva, a man who worked the railways his entire life. His hands, and he wrote, were better with a wrench than a pen, and he apologized for his poor writing. Elena could almost hear his voice, humble and strong, whispering from the page. He spoke of his dream, not of opulence, but of ownership. For years, he had saved every cruzeiro he could, patching his own clothes, eating simple meals, all for this one goal, a piece of earth that no one could take from his family, a place to build a small house, to plant a garden, to leave a legacy of stability for the children he had, and for the grandchildren he hoped to one day meet. He described his joy on the day he signed the legal papers, the feeling of the sun on his face as he walked the boundaries of his own 200 acres. As Elena read, she felt a profound echo of his hope in her own desolate heart. It was a dream of safety, a dream she understood with every fiber of her being. Then, the letter's tone began to shift, the looping letters tightening as if the pen were gripped by a hand clenched in fear and anger. Antonio began to write about the time, the early 1970s. He spoke of the leaden years, a time of military rule where the law was whatever the most powerful man in the room said it was. In their region, that man was a landowner known only as the Coronel. Elena felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The Coronel, Antonio wrote, was a man who took what he wanted, backed by corrupt police and politicians in the capital. He had an insatiable appetite for land, swallowing up the small holdings of poor farmers one by one, using intimidation and the tangled web of a bureaucracy that only served the rich. The name was a phantom, a local legend of terror, but as Elena read the description, the cold eyes, the air of untouchable power, she felt a prickle of unease, a sense of a shadow that had lingered over this land for decades, a shadow she was only now beginning to see. The crime was laid bare in stark, heartbreaking detail. The Coronel coveted Antonio's land. It was adjacent to his own vast cattle ranch and contained the region's only reliable year-round spring. He made an offer, a pittance, which Antonio proudly refused. That refusal, he wrote, was his gravest mistake. The letter described the nights that followed, the sound of a car engine idling on the track in the dead of night, the heavy, measured footsteps of men approaching the train car, the way they didn't knock, but simply stood outside, their silhouettes dark and menacing against the moonlight, a silent promise of violence. Antonio wrote of the fear, a cold, metallic taste in his mouth that never went away. He spoke of living in a constant state of siege, his dream of a peaceful homestead transformed into a nightmare of sleepless nights and daytime dread, waiting for the axe to fall. Elena clutched the letter, her own breathing shallow, her heart pounding in a terrified rhythm that matched her grandfather's 50-year-old fear. The end came swiftly. One evening, the Coronel came himself, accompanied by 2 of his thugs. They didn't threaten, they acted. Antonio described being dragged from the car, the rough hands gripping his arms, the sharp, blinding pain as a fist connected with his jaw. He was forced to his knees in the dirt, a pistol pressed cold and hard against his temple. They pushed a stack of papers at him, a forged sales contract filled with legal jargon he couldn't understand, and a quitclaim deed. They forced the pen into his hand and made him sign his name, the name of his wife. Everything. He described the utter humiliation, the feeling of his soul being stolen along with his land. The coroner tossed a thin envelope of cash at his feet, an insulting fraction of the land's worth, and told him to be gone by morning, or his wife and child would be next. Reading the words, Eleanor felt a surge of hot, incandescent rage. It was a visceral violation, a theft not just of property, but of a man's dignity and his family's future. But Antonio's spirit was not entirely broken. In that final, desperate night before he and his family fled into obscurity, he committed one last act of defiance. He took the true, original deed, the one he had so proudly framed, and carefully wrapped it in the oilcloth he used for his tools. He pried up the floorboard in his home, the only home he had ever truly owned, and hid the package. It was, he wrote, a seed of justice planted in poisoned soil. It was a prayer, a message in a bottle cast into the sea of time, hoping that one day the tide would turn. If you are reading this, my grandchild, the letter concluded, say it means my prayer was answered. This land is our blood, our right. Do not let the thief's son keep what was stolen. Fight for it. Eleanor's tears fell onto the old paper, smudging the 50-year-old ink. The letter was no longer just a story. It was a mandate, a sacred duty passed down to her. The weight of it was terrifying, but it was also a backbone of steel, firming her own resolve. In a region where nothing ever happened, the sight of a thin plume of smoke rising from the abandoned railway siding was an event. A local farmhand, riding the fence line of the vast Barros ranch, saw it first. He paused, shielding his eyes. His curiosity piqued. A family. Squatters. He thought little of it, but the story was good gossip. He mentioned it to another worker at the end of the day, who mentioned it to his wife, who mentioned it while buying flour at the local store. The news spread like a slow contagion through the sparse, interconnected community. It was a ripple in a stagnant pond, and the ripples eventually reached the shore of the main house, the sprawling hacienda from which Mr. Barros, son of the late coronel, presided over his empire. The news was relayed to him by his foreman over dinner. A woman and 2 kids, boss, living in the old train car. Mr. Barros paused, his fork hovering over his plate, his expression unreadable. A long, cold silence filled the room before he finally spoke. See to it. The sound came first, a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the floor of the train car. It was the sound of an engine straining, of heavy tires churning through mud. Elena's heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed the children, pulling them behind her, her body a frail shield. A battered, mud-splattered pickup truck, its grille bent and its paint faded, lurched to a stop a few yards from the door. The driver's side door creaked open and a man emerged. He was tall and broad, his frame filling the doorway. His face was a mask of deeply tanned leather, weathered by years of sun and wind, and his eyes were small, cold, and devoid of any warmth. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "This is private property," he boomed, his voice a gravelly rasp that carried easily over the wind. "Belongs to Dr. Barros. You have 24 hours to clear out." He didn't wait for a reply. He just stood there, his arms crossed over his massive chest, a silent, immovable mountain of intimidation. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. Every instinct screamed at Eleanor to run, to apologize, to obey, but the weight of her grandfather's letter in her pocket felt like a warm stone against her leg. It was a source of a strength she didn't know she possessed. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely function, but she forced herself to move. She reached into her coat and pulled out the deed. The creamy, official paper seemed to glow with an otherworldly light in the gloomy car. She stepped forward, out of the doorway and into the biting wind, holding the document in front of her like a holy relic. "No," she said, her voice a reedy whisper that was nearly snatched away by the wind. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing more volume, more conviction. "This land is mine." She jabbed a trembling finger at the document. "My name, Elena Maria da Silva. It's mine." The foreman squinted, his hostile certainty faltering for the first time. He took a step closer, peering at the paper. His eyes widened slightly. He pulled out a phone and stabbed at the screen. The next afternoon, a different vehicle appeared. There was no aggressive rumble this time, only a smooth, almost silent purr that spoke of wealth and power. A gleaming black SUV, so clean it looked photoshopped against the backdrop of rust and decay, glided to a stop in the exact spot the truck had occupied. The windows were tinted, reflecting the grey sky like obsidian mirrors. Eleanor's stomach clenched into a tight, cold knot. She knew who this was. The driver's door opened with a soft, expensive-sounding click. A man stepped out. He was in his early 70s, slender and upright, with a full head of silver hair combed perfectly into place. He wore pressed khaki trousers and a crisp, white button-down shirt, looking utterly incongruous in the muddy, derelict landscape. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his polished leather boots barely making a sound on the damp earth. This was not a foreman. This was the king, arriving to inspect a minor disturbance in his vast kingdom. This was the doctor. Mr. Barros approached, his steps measured and unhurried. A faint, pleasant scent of cologne drifted on the wind, a smell so out of place it was nauseating. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over the scene with a chillingly detached air. He looked at the rusted hulk of the train car, the ragged children peering from the doorway, and at Elena herself, her face smudged with dirt, her clothes thin and worn. A smile touched his lips, but it was a thin, bloodless thing that held no warmth, no kindness. It was the smile of a biologist observing a curious but ultimately insignificant life form. "Elena, is it?" he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I am Ricardo Barros. My foreman tells me there has been a misunderstanding." He exuded an aura of absolute authority, a calm, unshakable confidence that came from a lifetime of never being told no. Elena felt a primal fear, the instinctive terror of a mouse finding itself under the calm, patient gaze of a snake. This was the coronel's son, the bloodline of the thief. He gestured vaguely at the train car with a manicured hand. "I understand you found an old piece of paper, a historical curiosity." His tone was paternal, dismissive, as if speaking to a child with an overactive imagination. "These things happen. Clerical errors from a chaotic time. It has no legal standing, of course. My family has held the clear title to this land for 50 years. He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "However, I can see you are in a difficult situation. I am not an unreasonable man." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a thick white envelope. "I am prepared to offer you $2,000, a gift, to help you and your children find a proper place to live." He held out the envelope. From his other pocket, he produced a folded document and a pen. "This is just a simple form, a quitclaim, confirming the old error is resolved. You sign it, take the money, and we all move on. Simple." The casual way he proposed to buy her inheritance for less than the price of a used car was the ultimate insult. $2,000. The number exploded in Elena's mind like a flash grenade. It was salvation. It was a warm motel room, a mountain of groceries, new coats for Lucas and Sophia, medicine for her cough. It was an escape. The raw animal instinct for survival screamed at her to take it. Her hand twitched, an involuntary movement toward the envelope. The money was a physical presence, a seductive promise of an end to this waking nightmare. She could feel the imaginary warmth of a heater on her frozen skin, taste the phantom flavor of a hot meal in her mouth. All she had to do was sign a paper. Forget the past. Forget the ghost of a grandfather she never knew. Forget his impossible, dangerous prayer. The fight wasn't hers. Survival was hers. This was the sensible choice, the sane choice, the choice any mother would make to protect her children from immediate harm. Her entire body strained toward the money, toward safety, toward the abdication of this terrible, heavy burden she had just unearthed. But as her fingers began to extend, the image of her grandfather's face, beaten and kneeling in the dirt, flashed in her mind. She heard the echo of his written plea, "Fight for it." Her gaze dropped from the envelope to the ground, to the very soil he had been forced to surrender. A different feeling rose up, stronger than hunger, colder than fear. It was a deep, unyielding rage. It was pride. She lifted her head, and for the first time, she met Barros's gaze without flinching. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the space between them with the force of a physical blow. "The land is mine. I'm not signing anything. I'm not leaving." The thin smile on Barros's face evaporated instantly. His features seemed to harden, the pleasant mask melting away to reveal the cold, brutal predator beneath. He took a slow step closer, his voice dropping to a low, silky whisper. "This is very isolated land," he purred, the sound a chilling caress of violence. "How terrible things can happen out here. Fires, accidents. It would be a tragedy if something were to happen to your beautiful children." The threat, so calmly delivered, hung in the freezing air like a sharpened icicle poised over her head. He didn't need to shout. The promise of violence was absolute in his cold, confident eyes. Mr. Barrows gave her one last, long look, a look of final warning, then turned without another word. He slid back into the pristine cocoon of his SUV, the door closing with a solid, definitive thud. The engine purred to life, and the vehicle pulled away, its tires spitting mud as it disappeared down the track, leaving Elena enveloped in a cloud of exhaust fumes and suffocating dread. She stood frozen, the phantom weight of the $2,000 she had refused pressing down on her. The deed in her pocket felt less like a winning lottery ticket and more like her own death warrant. She had stared into the face of the monster her grandfather had warned her about, and she had challenged him. Now, alone in the vast, empty wilderness with her two small children, the crushing weight of her decision settled upon her. What would you do? Would you take the money and secure your children's safety, or risk their lives to fight for a justice 50 years in the making? The silence that swallowed the purr of the SUV's engine was a living entity, a heavy, suffocating presence that pressed in on Elena from all sides. She stood paralyzed, the muddy earth seeming to grip the soles of her worn shoes, rooting her to the spot where the threat had been delivered. Her blood ran cold, a slush of icy terror moving sluggishly through her veins. The air, still tainted with the faint, sickeningly sweet scent of Barros's cologne and the acrid smell of exhaust fumes, felt thick and unbreathable. His words, "accidents happen," replayed in her mind, a calm, silky loop of promised violence. A violent tremor began in her hands, a visible manifestation of the earthquake of fear that was tearing her apart from the inside. She looked at the rusted train car, which now seemed less like a shelter and more like a bullseye. She had not found an inheritance. She had painted a target on her children's backs, and the hunter was on his way. The $78 in her pocket felt as useless as dust. She stumbled back inside the car, the screech of the door hinge sounding like a scream. The interior was no longer just cold and damp. It was charged with a new and terrible energy. It was a death trap, and the timer had just been set. Lucas and Sophia huddled together, their small faces pale masks of fear, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, feeling the raw terror that radiated from their mother in waves. Sophia had her thumb in her mouth, a nervous habit she'd outgrown years ago, and her eyes were wide and swimming with unshed tears. Lucas stood rigidly, his little body a tight coil of tension, his gaze fixed on Eleanor's face, searching for an assurance she could not possibly give. A wave of suffocating guilt washed over Eleanor, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She had refused the money. She had chosen pride, chosen the ghost of her grandfather, over the immediate, tangible safety of her children. The weight of that choice was a physical burden, a crushing stone pressing down on her chest, making each breath a shallow, painful effort. Night fell with a terrifying finality. The darkness that seeped into the train car was no longer just an absence of light. It was a canvas for her fears. Every creak of the metal cooling, every rustle of a rat in the walls, every moan of the wind was transformed by her terror into the sound of approaching footsteps, the stealthy advance of Barros's men. She didn't sleep. She sat bolt upright, her back pressed against the cold metal wall, straining her ears, her entire body a tightly wound spring of vigilance. She held the heavy, rusted crowbar in her lap, a pathetic weapon against the kind of power Barrows wielded. The deed and the letter, tucked safely inside her coat, felt both impossibly heavy and terrifyingly fragile. They were her only hope and the cause of her damnation. Her stomach ached with a hunger that was now secondary to the gnawing, acidic churning of fear. She felt a profound, soul-crushing loneliness, the isolation of a soldier left behind on a battlefield after the war was already lost. As the first faint, grey light of dawn began to stain the eastern sky, a decision crystallized in Elena's exhausted mind. She could not stay here. The train car was a cage, a fixed point where they were simply waiting for the inevitable. Her grandfather's letter had said to fight, but fighting from a position of such weakness was suicide. She needed help. She needed an ally. The thought was almost laughable. Who in this desolate wasteland would dare to stand against a man like Ricardo Barros? Who would risk everything for a stranger and her 2 children? The hopelessness of it all threatened to swallow her. But then a flicker of a memory, a detail she had barely registered, returned to her. The farmhand who had first spotted their smoke, the man whose gossip had inadvertently summoned the devil to her door, had been riding a fence line. A fence line meant a boundary. A boundary meant a neighbor. It was a sliver of a chance so thin it was almost invisible, but it was more than she had now. The journey was a desperate gamble. She woke the children gently, her heart aching at their pale, exhausted faces. "We're going on another walk," she whispered, the lie tasting even more bitter than the first time. "As we're going to visit a friend." She wrapped the precious documents in their oilcloth sheath and secured them deep inside her coat. Leaving the relative, if terrifying, shelter of the train car felt like stepping off a cliff. The morning air was sharp and brutally cold, and a thin, icy rain had begun to fall, plastering their thin clothes to their skin within minutes. She followed the faint tracks left by Barros's SUV, a trail leading away from her prison and toward an unknown horizon. She carried Sophia, whose feverish warmth was a terrifying comfort, while Lucas trudged bravely beside her, his small hand locked tightly in hers. The landscape was a monotonous panorama of brown chars, dormant fields, and skeletal trees, a vast, empty stage for their small, desperate drama. Her body screamed with exhaustion, but she pushed onward, fueled by a terror that was stronger than fatigue. After nearly an hour of walking, a new shape appeared on the horizon, almost indistinguishable from the grey, misty backdrop. It wasn't a grand hacienda like the one she imagined Barros owned. It was a small, ramshackle structure, little more than a shack with a crooked tin roof and walls of weathered, unpainted wood. A thin, fragile tendril of white smoke curled from a rusty stovepipe chimney, a beacon of life in the desolate landscape. It was the most beautiful thing Elena had ever seen. As they drew closer, she could see the details. A neatly stacked pile of firewood, a small, well-tended garden plot covered for the winter, a single, faded plastic flamingo stuck in the dirt near the porch, a whimsical splash of color in a world of gray. The place felt reclusive, isolated, but it didn't feel menacing. It felt peaceful. A cautious, fragile hope began to bloom in her chest, a feeling so foreign she barely recognized it. She took a deep breath, the cold, damp air filling her lungs, and approached the door. Her knock was a feeble, hesitant tap, the sound swallowed by the vast, quiet landscape. For a long moment, there was no response. Eleanor's heart sank. Maybe no one was home. Maybe this, too, was a dead end. She was about to turn away when she heard a slow, shuffling sound from within, followed by the scraping noise of a bolt being drawn. The door creaked open a few inches, revealing a sliver of a man's face. He was ancient, his skin a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, watery blue that seemed clouded with the dust of years. He was thin and stooped, his body bent and twisted by a lifetime of hard labor. He peered at them with a look of cautious suspicion, his gaze lingering on the children shivering at her side. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice a dry, reedy rasp like the rustle of dead leaves. It wasn't an unkind voice, but it was the voice of a man who had long ago chosen solitude over the company of others. This was the hermit, the forgotten man at the edge of the world. "I'm sorry to bother you," Elena began, her own voice trembling with cold and nerves. "My name is Elena. These are my children, Lucas and Sophia. We are in trouble." The old man's gaze softened almost imperceptibly as he looked at the children again. He saw Sophia's pale, feverish face, her racking cough, the way Lucas stood protectively beside his mother, trying to be brave. He looked at Elena, at the desperation etched into the lines of her face, the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes, the fierce, protective fire that burned there despite it all. He was silent for what felt like an eternity, his pale eyes seeming to look right through her, weighing her, judging her story before she had even told it. Finally, he sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "Get inside before you freeze to death," he rasped, pulling the door fully open. The invitation was grudging, but it was an invitation nonetheless, and Elena felt a wave of relief so profound her knees almost buckled. The interior of the shack was a single, small room, but it was a world away from the train car. It was spotlessly clean and surprisingly warm, heated by a small pot-bellied wood stove that glowed with a comforting orange light. The air smelled of wood smoke, brewing coffee, and old books. Simple wooden shelves lined one wall, neatly stacked with worn paperbacks. A narrow cot was perfectly made in one corner, and a small, scrubbed wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. It was a space of Spartan simplicity, but it radiated a sense of order, dignity, and peace. The old man gestured for them to sit at the table, then shuffled over to the stove. Without a word, he poured hot water from a kettle into a tin mug, adding a spoonful of instant coffee, and placed it in front of Elena. The warmth of the mug seeping into her frozen hands was an almost unbearably pleasant sensation. It was the first act of simple, human kindness she had received in what felt like a lifetime. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. The old man introduced himself as Afonso. He moved slowly, his joints stiff and protesting, but with an economy of motion that spoke of long-practiced routines. He gave the children a cup of warm water with a little sugar in it, and a piece of dry bread, which they devoured with a ferocious hunger that made Eleanor's heart ache. He sat down opposite her, his pale eyes studying her face over the rim of his own mug. "Trouble with Barros, I expect," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. In this part of the country, all serious trouble eventually led back to that one name. Elena nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She took a sip of the hot, bitter coffee, the warmth spreading through her chest, giving her the strength to continue. She decided to risk everything. She reached into her coat, her hand closing around the cool, greasy oilcloth. "I found something," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "in the old train car. Something that belonged to my grandfather." The name hung in the air, a key waiting for the right lock. She placed the oilcloth package on the small wooden table between them. The dark, pristine bundle looked alien in the simple, rustic room. Afonso stared at it, his wrinkled face completely devoid of expression, but Elena saw a flicker in his pale eyes, a subtle change, a dawning recognition that made her own heart beat faster. "My grandfather's name was Antonio da Silva," she said softly. "He was a railway worker." At the mention of the name, Afonso flinched as if he had been struck. A sharp, ragged breath escaped his lips. His hand, which had been resting on the table, began to tremble. His watery blue eyes, which had seemed so distant, suddenly became sharp and intensely focused, fixed on the oilcloth package with a look of dawning horror and awe. He knew. The realization hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. This man, this reclusive stranger, didn't just know the name. He knew the story. He was a part of it. The past was not dead. It had been sitting here, in this shack, waiting. With trembling fingers, Eleanor unwrapped the package. The crackle of the oilcloth loud in the silent room. She laid the deed and the folded letter on the table. The creamy white of the official document and the faded blue ink of the letter seemed to vibrate with a hidden energy. Afonso stared at them, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He didn't reach for them. He simply stared, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, shock, grief, and something that looked terrifyingly like guilt. "Antonio," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. He said he would. He swore he would hide it. His gaze lifted from the papers to Elena's face, and for the first time she saw the full, devastating weight of 50 years of sorrow in his eyes. "You have her eyes," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "His daughter's eyes. Your mother's." A single tear traced a path down his deeply wrinkled cheek, a river cutting through a desert of time. The final piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. The story came pouring out of him, a torrent of confession 50 years in the making. The words tumbled over each other, choked with guilt and grief. Afonso, it turned out, had been Antonio's closest friend. They had started on the railway together as young men, sharing meals, dreams, and hardships. He described Antonio's fierce pride, his unwavering honesty, and his all-consuming dream of owning that piece of land. Afonso had been there the day Antonio bought it, had celebrated with him, had walked the acres with him, sharing in his friend's profound joy. He spoke of Antonio as a brother, his voice cracking with a sorrow that was still as raw as an open wound. As he spoke, Elena felt the ghost of her grandfather solidify, no longer just a name on a page, but a vibrant, living man, seen through the eyes of someone who had loved him. The shack filled with the presence of their shared past, a heavy, sorrowful energy that made the air thick and hard to breathe. Then came the confession, the poison he had held inside for half a century. His voice dropped to a choked whisper, his eyes fixed on some distant, terrible memory. He had been there that night. He hadn't been in the train car, but hidden in the brush nearby. Drawn by the sound of the coroner's car, paralyzed by fear, he had watched the entire nightmare unfold. He described the sickening thud of fists against his friend's body, the sight of Antonio on his knees, the cold, metallic glint of the pistol against his temple in the moonlight. He had heard the coroner's low, menacing voice, had seen the papers being forced into Antonio's hand. He had witnessed the theft, the brutal, violent erasure of his friend's dream, and he had done nothing. He had remained hidden, a coward in the shadows, while his brother was broken and robbed. The shame of that moment, he whispered, had been a cancer on his soul ever since, eating away at him for 5 long decades. The room was thick with the stench of his ancient, suffocating guilt. Elena listened, her own anger and grief mingling with a profound pity for this broken old man. He was not just an ally, he was a casualty of the same crime, a man whose spirit had been held captive by the same injustice that had stolen her family's future. His guilt was a testament to his friend's fate. After revealing the horror he had witnessed, Afonso rose on shaky legs and shuffled over to a small, locked wooden trunk at the foot of his cot. He fumbled with a key that hung on a string around his neck, his hands shaking so badly it took him several tries to open the lock. He lifted the lid, and the scent of old paper and cedar filled the small room. From beneath a pile of neatly folded clothes, he withdrew a small, leather-bound book, a journal. He placed it on the table next to Antonio's letter, its dark cover worn smooth with time. "I couldn't fight them," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was a coward, but I could write. I wrote down everything. The date, the time, the names of the thugs with the coronal, everything I saw, everything I heard." The journal was the final, devastating piece of evidence. It was not just a story, it was a record, a contemporaneous eyewitness account, kept secret for 50 years, a perfect corroboration of the tale told in Antonio's letter. It transformed their fight from one of his word against Barros's to a mountain of evidence against a crumbling wall of lies. As Elena stared at the 3 objects on the table, the deed, the letter, and the journal, she felt the scales of justice, so long tipped against her family, begin to shift. The weight on her shoulders was still immense, but it was no longer the dead weight of despair. It was the heavy, powerful weight of the truth. For the first time, she felt a genuine spark of hope, a fierce, burning conviction that this was a fight they could actually win. Afonso, having unburdened his soul, seemed to stand a little straighter. The stoop in his shoulders lessened, as if a physical weight had been lifted from him. A new light shone in his pale eyes, the clear, steady light of purpose. They spent the rest of the day in a state of tense, focused calm. Afonso, energized by his confession, became a quiet whirlwind of activity. He made a simple, nourishing soup, insisting that Elena and the children eat. He found a small box of his own daughter's long outgrown clothes for Sophia and a thick, woolen sweater for Lucas. The small acts of care were a balm to Elena's frayed soul. She watched her children, their bellies full for the first time in days, their faces finally relaxed, dozing near the warmth of the stove. A fragile sense of peace settled over the small shack, a temporary sanctuary from the storm that was gathering outside. Afonso read passages from his journal aloud, his reedy voice giving life to the faded ink. The details were meticulous, the observations sharp, painting a damning portrait of the coronel's reign of terror and the specific crime against Antonio. They now had a weapon, forged from a grandfather's defiance and a friend's guilt, and they began to formulate a plan. The plan was simple, desperate, and hinged on a single contact Afonso had maintained for years, a human rights lawyer in the state capital, a man who specialized in cases of restorative justice for crimes committed during the dictatorship. "He's been waiting for this," Afonso explained, his voice filled with a newfound strength. "I've written to him over the years, telling him the story, telling him I was a witness, but that I had no proof that would hold up. I told him I was waiting for a sign from Antonio." He looked at Elena, a sense of wonder on his face. "You are the sign." The plan was to wait for morning for the lawyer's office to open. Afonso would make the call. They would bypass the corrupt local police entirely and bring in federal authorities. The idea was terrifying in its audacity, but it was their only path. For the first time, the future was not a black wall of dread, but a narrow, treacherous path leading toward a distant light. They were no longer just victims. They were plotters, architects of a long-delayed justice. As evening descended, casting long, deep shadows across the fields, the fragile peace of the shack was shattered. It began as a low, distant rumble, a vibration felt more than heard, a familiar, guttural sound that made Elena's blood run cold. It was not the smooth purr of Barros's luxury SUV. It was the aggressive, throbbing growl of heavy-duty trucks, the same sound that had haunted her nightmares. Afonso heard it too. He froze, his head cocked, his face instantly pale. The sound grew louder, closer, splitting into two distinct engines. They weren't on the main road. They were on the service track, heading directly for the train car. A cold, sick certainty washed over Elena. Barros hadn't waited. His patience had run out. He wasn't coming to talk. He was coming to follow through on his promise. He was coming to erase the problem, to erase the train car, the evidence, and anyone who happened to be inside. Her heart seized in her chest. Her children. A new, more primal terror eclipsed everything else. The image of the train car, with her children inside, being surrounded by these men, flashed through her mind. The relief she had felt at finding Afonso was instantly replaced by a fresh wave of horror. If they hadn't left, if they had stayed in the car, they would be trapped. Barros didn't know they had moved. His men were going to the last place she had been seen. "They're going to the train car," she gasped, her voice strangled with panic. Afonso's eyes were wide with the same horrifying realization. They both knew what accidents meant. They knew what happened when powerful men wanted to make a problem disappear permanently. A fire, a terrible, tragic fire that would destroy the old, rotten train car and anyone inside it, leaving nothing behind but ash and a plausible story for the corrupt local sheriff. The men weren't coming to threaten. They were coming to commit murder. Just as the thought formed, a horrifying new sound cut through the night. It was a loud, metallic crump, followed by the distinct tinkle of shattering glass. The sound came from the direction of the train car. It was the sound of a window being broken, of a forced, violent entry. Elena's stomach dropped. They were breaking into the car, looking for her. The thought of what would happen when they found it empty was even more terrifying. They would search. They would find their tracks in the mud. They would know she had gone to the only other dwelling for miles. They would come here. They were no longer just trying to destroy the evidence. They were now actively hunting her. The tiny, warm shack, which had felt like a fortress just moments before, now felt like a fragile, wooden trap. They were cornered, with the wolves circling, their path of retreat cut off, the darkness alive with enemies. The rumble of the truck engine suddenly cut out, plunging the world into a shocking, profound silence. That silence was more menacing than the noise had been. It was the silence of predators who had reached their hunting ground and were now moving with stealth. Elena could hear her own heart pounding, a frantic drum against her ribs. She could hear the shallow, terrified breaths of her children, who were now wide awake, their eyes huge in the dim lamplight. Then, a new light appeared, a distant, flickering orange glow against the dark horizon in the exact direction of the train car. The glow was unsteady at first, then it swelled, growing brighter, angrier. A fire. They had set it on fire. Even from miles away, she could feel the heat of its malice. They were burning her history. Her grandfather's home, her only shelter. They were erasing her, scorching her from the face of the earth. A final, brutal act of dominance. Eleanor stared at the orange glow, mesmerized by the horror of it. They were burning it all. The thought that she and her children would have been inside that inferno, if not for the desperate flight to Afonso's shack, sent a wave of nausea through her. But the horror was quickly replaced by a cold, clear realization. The fire was a beacon. It announced to the world, or at least to them, that the hunt had begun in earnest. When the thugs found the car empty, their next stop would be here. It was no longer a question of if, but when. Time had run out. They had minutes, at best, before the headlights would be sweeping across this very shack. The plan to wait until morning was now a fantasy, a luxury they could no longer afford. Action was required, right now. In the dead of night, with the enemy closing in, the moment of decision, the true turning point, was upon them. "They're coming here next," Afonso whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. He was already moving, his old, stiff limbs animated by a surge of adrenaline. He grabbed a small, worn satchel from a peg on the wall and began stuffing the precious evidence inside: the deed, the letter, and his own leather-bound journal. He moved with a frantic but determined purpose. "We can't stay. We have to run." Run where? The question screamed in Elena's mind. Outside was a vast, cold darkness, patrolled by violent men. But staying was a death sentence. As Afonso secured the satchel, the distant rumble of an engine starting up again reached them. It was a single truck this time, its engine revving angrily. It wasn't heading away. It was turning, its sound growing marginally louder. It was coming toward them. The headlights hadn't appeared yet, but they were on their way. The wolves had picked up their scent. Elena scooped up a drowsy, whimpering Sophia, her small body limp with sleep and fear. "Lucas, hold on to my coat and don't let go," she commanded, her voice tight with a control she did not feel. Lucas Mai, his face a pale oval in the lamplight, nodded silently. His eyes wide with terror, but his jaw set with a grim determination that mirrored her own. He grabbed a fistful of her coat, his knuckles white. Afonso blew out the lamp, plunging the room into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint, malevolent orange glow on the horizon and the slivers of moonlight filtering through the single small window. The familiar, comforting room was instantly transformed into a space of shadows and fear. "The back way," Afonso rasped, his voice a disembodied whisper in the dark. "Through the woods. They won't expect that. It will lead us to the old highway." It was a desperate, chaotic flight into the unknown. They slipped out the back door of the shack, a flimsy wooden door that protested with a low groan. The cold hit them like a physical blow, a shocking, breathless plunge into a freezing, hostile world. The ground was wet and slick, and the icy rain had started again. The orange glow from the burning train car cast long, dancing shadows, turning the familiar woods into a terrifying labyrinth of monstrous shapes. The sound of the approaching truck was louder now, a constant, menacing growl that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Elena's heart felt as if it would burst from her chest. She adjusted the weight of Sophia in her arms, the child's frightened whimpers muffled against her shoulder. Lucas stumbled behind her, his grip on her coat like a vice. Afonso, clutching the precious satchel to his chest, led the way, his frail form surprisingly agile as he plunged into the darkness of the trees. This was it, the final, desperate race for their lives. Just as they were swallowed by the deep shadows of the first line of trees, the world behind them exploded with light. A brilliant white beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the clearing where the shack stood. The headlights. They had arrived. The beam sliced through the trees just yards from where they were hiding, a blade of light that momentarily illuminated their terrified faces. They froze, pressing themselves against the rough, wet bark of the trees, trying to make themselves invisible. The truck lurched to a stop in front of the shack, its engine idling with a low, predatory rumble. Doors slammed. The harsh, angry voices of men cut through the night air. They were shouting, their words indistinct, but their tone filled with frustrated rage. They had found the shack, the last bastion of safety, and the hunt was about to become a chase. Elena closed her eyes, her body trembling uncontrollably, praying to a god she wasn't sure she believed in. Afonso tugged on her sleeve, his touch urgent. He pointed deeper into the woods, his face a grim mask in the reflected light. There was no time to wait, no time to hide. They had to move, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the hunters. They began to run, a clumsy, frantic scramble through the dense undergrowth. Branches whipped at their faces, scratching their skin. Thorns tore at their clothes. Their feet slipped and slid on the slick, leaf-strewn ground. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like a gunshot in the tense, terrifying quiet between the men's shouts. Eleanor's lungs burned, her legs felt like lead, but she pushed on, driven by the image of her children's faces and the sound of the angry voices behind them. They were no longer just running from Barros, they were running towards justice, carrying the proof in a worn leather satchel, a desperate flight through the dark heart of the night. The shouting behind them grew more organized. A beam of a powerful flashlight began to cut through the woods, sweeping back and forth, a searching eye of light that sought them out. "We have to be faster," Afonso gasped, his breathing ragged and shallow. He was an old man, and the frantic pace was taking its toll. Elena knew he couldn't keep this up for long. She could feel the men gaining on them, their clumsy crashing through the wood sounding closer with every passing second. The panic was a living thing in her throat, a scream she had to choke down. They burst through a thicket and onto a narrow, barely there path. It was a small mercy, a chance to move with a little more speed, but the path also made them more exposed. They were a trio of desperate ghosts fleeing through the night, hunted by men who would not stop until they were silenced forever. They were out of time and out of options. As they stumbled along the path, Afonso suddenly stopped, leaning against a tree, his chest heaving, his face ashen in the gloom. "I can't," he gasped, clutching the satchel. "You go. Take the children." "Take this." He tried to thrust the bag into her hands. At that exact moment, a flashlight beam swept over them, freezing them in its brilliant, white glare for a split second before moving on. They had been seen. A triumphant shout echoed through the woods behind them. Much closer now. "There they are!" The chase was over. The confrontation was about to begin. But as the footsteps pounded closer, Afonso did something unexpected. He pulled a small, ancient-looking mobile phone from his pocket, a relic from another era. His fingers, trembling but sure, stabbed at the buttons, dialing a number he knew by heart. He raised the phone to his ear as Elena stared in disbelief. A voice answered on the other end. Afonso took one last ragged breath and spoke, his words a defiant cry against the approaching darkness. "It's Afonso," he said, his voice ringing with 50 years of conviction. "The proof has been found. It's time." The world held its breath in the split second after Afonso's call ended. The angry shouts of the thugs faltered, replaced by a confused silence. Then a new sound began to slice through the night, a sound utterly alien to this remote, lawless land. It was a high-pitched, insistent wail, growing rapidly closer. Sirens, but they weren't the familiar, wheezing sirens of the local sheriff's department. These were sharp, modern, and backed by the sound of multiple powerful engines. A sleek, unmarked black sedan was the first to burst into the clearing, its tires tearing through the mud. A man in a sharp suit, his face a mask of grim determination, stepped out. He was the lawyer. The hunters froze, their flashlights dropping slightly, their faces caught between arrogance and dawning panic. From the edge of the woods, Eleanor watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, not with fear, but with a wild-armed disbelieving hope. The tide, impossibly, was turning. The cavalry had arrived. Following the lawyer's car, a formidable convoy roared into the clearing, their headlights turning the night into an interrogation room. 2 dark blue SUVs with the official insignia of the Policia Federal, the federal police, boxed in the thugs' pickup truck. Doors flew open, and a team of officers emerged, their movements swift, professional, and radiating an aura of uncompromising authority. They were clad in black tactical gear, carrying weapons that made the thugs' hunting rifles look like toys. They fanned out, securing the area with a chilling efficiency that spoke of a different level of power, a power that did not negotiate with local strongmen. From a third car, a journalist and a photographer spilled out, their cameras already flashing, the strobes capturing the dumbfounded expressions of the would-be assassins. In the space of 30 seconds, Barros's men had gone from predators to cornered, pathetic rats, caught in the unblinking glare of federal justice and the national media. Guided by a frantic Afonso, a detachment of officers raced through the woods toward the orange glow that still painted the sky. They found the scene just as Elena had pictured it, only more damning. The train car was engulfed in flames, a funeral pyre sending sparks and smoke into the night sky, and in the flickering, hellish light stood Barros's other two men, caught in the very act of pouring gasoline from large red canisters onto the burning structure, trying to accelerate its destruction. The air was thick with the suffocating fumes of fuel and burning wood. The officers' shouts of, "Federal Police! Drop it!" were sharp commands that cut through the roar of the fire. The thugs froze, their faces illuminated by the inferno they had created, their expressions a perfect portrait of guilt and shock. The photographer's flash went off again and again, capturing the irrefutable, front-page-worthy image, the men, the gasoline cans, and the burning evidence they were so desperately trying to destroy. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold as the federal convoy, now carrying its cargo of captured thugs, swept up the long, manicured driveway of the Barros Hacienda. Mr. Barros was standing on his expansive veranda, a delicate porcelain cup of coffee in his hand, his initial expression of irritation at the commotion turning to one of utter disbelief. The illusion of his untouchable power was shattered by the sight of the federal insignia on the doors of the vehicles. The human rights lawyer stepped out, flanked by two imposing federal agents. He walked calmly up the stone steps, carrying Afonso's worn leather satchel as if it were a holy relic. Barros opened his mouth to protest, to bluster, to name-drop the powerful politicians on his payroll, but no sound came out. He saw Afonso step out from behind the lawyer, his old Mahon frail friend, now standing as his accuser, his face grim and resolute. The king, in his castle, was about to face judgment. The lawyer placed the contents of the satchel on a polished outdoor table. The pristine, 50-year-old deed, the faded, heart-wrenching letter from Antonio, and finally, Afonso's journal, opened to the page detailing the night of the crime. "This is the true deed to the land you occupy, Mr. Barros," the lawyer said, his voice level and cold. "This is a letter from the man your father brutalized and robbed, and this," he tapped the journal, "is a contemporaneous eyewitness account of that crime, a crime you attempted to finish last night by murdering his granddaughter and her children." Barros stared at the evidence, his face draining of all color. He saw his world, built on a foundation of theft and violence, crumbling before his eyes. He stammered, denying everything, but his words were hollow. The quiet click of handcuffs being snapped onto his wrists was the loudest sound Elena had ever heard. It was the sound of justice, delayed for half a century, finally arriving. The story became a national sensation. "The waitress who toppled a coronel" was the headline that blazed across newspapers and websites. The photograph of the thugs with the gasoline cans became a symbol of the lingering brutalities of the dictatorship era. Elena's story, told in her own quiet, dignified voice on national television, resonated deeply with a public hungry for justice. The case became a legal precedent, opening the door for hundreds of other families to reclaim land and dignity stolen from them during those dark years. Afonso's testimony was televised, his quiet, guilt-ridden confession transforming him from a hermit into a national hero. Elena found herself an unwitting symbol of hope, her simple courage inspiring a national conversation about memory, history, and the long, slow but inexorable arc of the moral universe bending toward justice. She handled the attention with a grace that surprised everyone, most of all herself, always steering the focus back to her grandfather's name. The legal proceedings were a formality, faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence: the deed, the journal, the eyewitness, the captured thugs, the photographic proof of attempted murder, yes, and immense public pressure. The Barros family's legal empire collapsed. The court swiftly affirmed the original deed and declared Elena Maria da Silva the sole and rightful owner of the entire 200-acre property. Financial advisors, dispatched by the Human Rights Organization, explained to a stunned Elena that the land, bordering a rapidly expanding urban area, was worth millions. She looked at the numbers on the page, the string of zeros that seemed to go on forever, and felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. The first thing she did was authorize the sale of a small 5-acre parcel. The wire transfer that hit her new bank account contained more money than her family had seen in generations. The crushing weight of poverty, her constant companion for 32 years, lifted all at once, leaving her breathless in its absence. That first winter in their new home was a symphony of warmth and security. A beautiful, light-filled house, built with a portion of her new fortune, now stood on a gentle slope overlooking the very spring her grandfather had cherished. The air inside smelled of cinnamon and baking bread, a stark contrast to the memory of mold and decay. Lucas and Sophia, their cheeks rosy and full, their coughs a distant memory, chased each other through rooms filled with books and laughter. Elena, no longer gaunt with hunger and fear, found a new purpose. She spent her evenings not shivering in terror, but in a plush armchair by a roaring fire, sketching plans for the Antonio da Silva Community Center, a project she was funding to provide legal aid, job training, and childcare for women fighting their way out of poverty and violence. It was a legacy of strength, born from a legacy of pain. Her grandfather had wanted to leave a house. She would build a haven. One crisp autumn evening, Elena served a feast. A long wooden table was laden with roasted chicken, creamy mashed potatoes, vibrant salads, and a rich chocolate cake, a bounty that would have seemed like a cruel fantasy just 1 year before. Lucas and Sophia ate with the unbridled joy of children who would never know hunger again, while Afonso, now a cherished grandfather to them, watched with tears glistening in his old eyes. After dinner, Eleanor stood at the large picture window, a cup of coffee warming her hands. In the distance, spotlit against the night, stood the solitary, rust-eaten train car. She had paid to have it moved and preserved, not as a reminder of her suffering, but as a monument to her family's resilience. It was no longer a tomb of despair, but a testament to a truth that could not be burned, a grandfather's love that could not be extinguished, and a prayer that had traveled across 50 years to find its answer. Elena's journey from the edge of oblivion to a life of security and purpose is a testament to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, a single spark of truth can ignite a fire of justice. She fought not just for land, but for her family's dignity and the memory of a man she never met. Her story proves that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. The world is full of hidden stories and forgotten injustices waiting for a champion. To hear more incredible true stories of survival, struggle, and ultimate redemption that will inspire you and restore your faith in the human spirit, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring the bell. You won't want to miss the powerful journeys we have yet to share.